So we have talked about the determination of eligibility, the evaluation process, the use of the information to determine if a student will be eligible for special education services. We've talked about determining the needs of the student, developing the PLAF statement, deciding how best to support the student's needs through goals and objectives, transition plans, accommodations, modifications, and/or programs and services. We've also talked about the inclusion of the assessment information and the ESY discussion that must happen at all IEPs. Now that you have completed the IEP, you've done your draft pieces, you have one final piece that we have to talk about, and that's notice. So we're going to start by looking at the federal regulations around notice. So the first one is when the district is required to provide notice. And this is Regulation 300-503, and it covers all the information about providing notice. And it's 300-503A12. Written notice that meets the requirements of paragraph B of this section must be given to the parents of a child with a disability a reasonable time before the public agency proposes to initiate or change the identification, evaluation, or educational placement of the child or the provision of FAPE to the child. So if the district's going to provide initial services, or they say that the student's no longer EI, maybe they're LD, they're going to change the identification, they're going to evaluate or change the educational placement, possibly from an EI room to an LD room, or they're going to finish up the IEP and offer that as a free appropriate public education, the parent must be provided notice. They also have to provide notice if they refuse to initiate or change the identification, evaluation, or educational placement of the child, or change the provision of FAPE that the child's being offered. They have to include information, what they considered, and why they decided not to do it. The notice requirement is to help ensure that parents are notified and informed throughout the special education process. The next piece of that same regulation is what the notice is required to contain. It's also 300-503B 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So the notice required under paragraph A of this section must include a description of the action proposed or refused by the agency. So if a parent wants to change the special education eligibility of a student and the district has to consider it, but they don't necessarily have to do it, but they have to say that they considered it and why they chose not to do it. The notice has to contain an explanation of why the agency proposes or refuses to take the action, a description of each evaluation procedure, assessment, record, or report the agency used as a basis for the proposed or refused action, a statement that the parents of a child with a disability have protection under the procedural safeguards of this part, and if this notice is not an initial referral for evaluation, because the parents would have been provided with a procedural safeguards notice then, the means by which a copy of a description of the procedural safeguard notices can be obtained. Sources for the parents to contact to obtain assistance in understanding the provision of this part. A description of other options that the IEP team considered and the reasons why those options were rejected, and a description of other factors that are relevant to the agency's proposal or refusal. So remember, if we're talking about the continuum of services for programs, which ones was it considered for the student to go out to gen ed? Was it considered for the student to be in an LD classroom? And why were maybe neither of those options decided to be used? So the notice has to include that information. The next part of that federal regulation is the requirements to make the notice understandable. That's 500-503C, II, II, and III. The notice required under paragraph A of this section must be written in language understandable to the general public and provided in the native language of the parent or other mode of communication used by the parent, unless it is clearly not feasible to do so. If the native language or other mode of communication of the parent is not a written language, the public agency must take steps to ensure that the notice is translated orally or by other means to the parent in his or her native language or other mode of communication, that the parent understands the content of the notice, and that there is written evidence that the requirements in paragraphs C, 2I, and II of this section have been met. The purpose of the notice document is to inform, provide evidence of the district's offer of FAPE, provide documentation of options considered and reasons an option was not chosen, and provide information that the student was, or provide information that the student was not found eligible for special ed services. There's forms that are used to capture this information. It's important to remember the form is not part of the IEP forms. And you can either use the notice for initial provision of service and programs, which is used to include the IEP team meetings resulting from an initial evaluation, or there's a section to obtain parental consent for initial provision of special ed services. There's also a form, programs and notices for provision of services and programs, that's used to conclude the process for all other IEP team or related meetings other than the initial. So the reevaluation, the annual reviews, or if you're doing an amendment to the IEP. The state has model forms developed to record the necessary information. The forms are, remember, the forms are not part of the IEP forms, but the notice forms are an essential part of the IEP process, and they align with the IEP form. As was stated in the federal regs, there are certain pieces that must be included in the notice form. So let's take a look at that. Information to include in the notice. The IEP date meeting that's identified on the IEP form must match the IEP team meeting date identified in the notice form. You have to have the date when the IEP will be implemented. When are you going to start providing those services? And the district can initiate a proposed special ed IEP as soon as possible and not more than 15 school days after the parent's receipt of written notification. That's the requirement. You have to include where the programs and services are to be provided, so like what school district, how the notice was delivered and the date of delivery. You have to provide information that the procedural safeguards were provided and the way in which a copy of the procedural safeguards notice can be obtained, and any additional resources to parents in order to assist them in understanding their rights. And one of the pieces that I didn't write in here, but that's included, if the student is going to attend another district, like if they're living in this district but the program that they're going to take part in is in another district, that person has to be invited to the IEP and information has to be included because they have to okay those services. You also have to include, you have to document any other options that were considered. You have to capture options for the student that were considered but not selected. You have to provide evidence and database decision or reasons of non-selected options, and you have to describe any other factors that lead to the proposal or refusal of the programs and services discussed during the IEP meeting. So if an IEP team member makes a request, like let's say a parent would like their child to have speech therapy and there is no documented need in this area, the district can opt not to provide the service. However, it needs to be documented on the notice form that it was considered and why the team determined that the service was not going to be provided. You have to use data, evaluation results, etc. to support why the service is not being provided. The district cannot use finances as a reason not to provide a program or service to the student. You have to provide notice to the parent within 10 school days of receipt of a written request for any evaluation. Within 7 school days from the date of the Individualized Education Program team meeting, the public agency shall provide the parent with the notice of an offer of a free appropriate public education, which is the IEP, or determination of ineligibility. The notice can be given to the parent at the IEP team meeting if the parent's in attendance, and you can sign all those then. But they can, if they're not there, it has to be provided within 7 school days from the date of the IEP program meeting. So that's pretty straightforward. The requirements that are set in the federal regulations give you pretty clear expectations of what must be done related to notice. If you have any questions, please make sure you contact me or post a question in eCollege.